Okay, so I think we'll get started. So first of all, my name is Richard Bater. I'm a climate risk analyst at the global climate risk advisory and analytics firm Acclimatise. I'd like to welcome you all today to the launch webinar of guidance that we've been co-writing with MinterEllison for Chapter 0. The unique feature of this guidance is that we set out 9 key questions that we believe would really help to strengthen the ways in which non-executive directors can exercise oversight of the companies on whose boards they sit. This guidance has been a joint effort, so we're really happy to have worked with MinterEllison and the team, Ellie Mulholland and Sarah Barker at MinterEllison on this guidance. I'd like to extend my thanks also to my colleague John Firth, Robin Hammaker-Taylor, and also, of course, the team at Chapter 0, Karina Litvak and Natasha Fortuin. We have a great panel today to introduce this guidance for you. I'll be taking a back seat, but we'll be kicking off with a brief introduction by the director of the global network of Chapter 0 chapters, Karina Litvak. I'll be followed by the CEO of Acclimatise, John Firth, and following John will be Ellie Mulholland, a senior associate at MinterEllison law firm and director of the Climate Change Commonwealth Climate Law Initiative. So that's the agenda. First we'll have this introduction, then we'll have the primer digest led by John. We'll have governance and liability in a changing climate by Ellie Mulholland, and a question and answer, followed by a close and next steps. The webinar will last around 1 hour. I'd like to invite everybody to please keep your microphones on mute throughout, if possible. I advise everybody that the webinar is being recorded, and it will be uploaded to be shared and viewed again online following the webinar. There will be a Q&A, but in order to share your questions, please enter those into the chat box on the bottom right of the screen. At any point during the webinar, we will be collecting these questions, collating them, and after the main presentations, I will be putting as many of these questions as I can to the speakers. Finally, we will be sharing a survey towards the end of the webinar. We'd really appreciate your participation in this survey. We do intend to follow up this guidance with more targeted sector-specific sets of questions that you can be asking boards. And in aid of that, it would really help us to understand what sectors you're particularly interested in that support on. So without further ado, I will be handing over now to Karina Litvak, who will introduce Chapter 0. Karina.
Here we go. Shoot. Now can you hear me? Good.
Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Karina Litvak. I'm very glad to be here. I wanted to say a couple of words about Chapter 0. Chapter 0 is an organization that was launched just over a year ago in the United Kingdom. It is part of a global network of hubs for non-executive directors. We have already chapters in Italy, France, Switzerland, Canada, Brazil, and we're growing in South Africa. We've got 4 in Asia, and Canada, US. So we're growing faster than I can keep track of. And my role here is both to enable the growth of the international chapters, but most importantly for purposes of today's meeting, work with people like Acclimatise, who I thank profusely for their excellent work today, to produce training modules that are very practical use for directors in the boardroom. And if any of you are like me, I certainly have found myself in the boardroom struggling with how to bring these questions into the boardroom in a way that is really practical, really constructive, and really helps lift what we're doing and change the way that we run our businesses. And by that, I mean not just necessarily tweaking the operational practices. Sometimes that's sufficient. But in some cases, it really means rethinking fundamentally the business model. And each of these modules helps us understand better how our businesses are positioned in the face of a rapidly changing world with, in this particular case, a rapidly changing climate. This is the first and only so far module that we are doing on the subject of climate adaptation. So it's unique and it's really plugs a gap. I'm delighted to have it. All of the other modules that we've been looking at focus on the transition side of the climate challenge. So looking at how companies can reduce their emissions. This is about saying, fine, climate change is going to happen no matter how hard we work to avert it. And we are going to have to take all sorts of ambitious measures to position our companies for resilience. And this module helps all of us bring that discussion into the boardroom. So I'll stop right here now because we have so much meat to go through, and I'm delighted to hand over to my colleagues. Thank you very much.
I think you're on mute, Richard.
Thank you very much, Karina. That was excellent. I'll now be handing over to John Firth, the CEO of Acclimatise. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Karina and Richard, and welcome everybody to this webinar. Thank you for sparing the time in busy days to join us. Acclimatise, as it says here, a specialist advisory and analytics company, and we only actually focus on adaptation resilience. We've been around now for 15 years. We're probably, or we believe, we're the largest pure play consultancy business in the world that just focus on adaptation resilience. 400 projects, 70 countries, and increasingly doing more and more work in the financial and corporate world, and not least since the advent of TCFD, which has clearly been a game changer and has brought physical risk as well as transition risk right onto not just the board agenda, but the senior management agenda and the operational agendas of major corporates and financial organizations. We believe very strongly and have a passionate belief in that we can help our clients become more resilient, and through that, actually, we as a world can be better for that in terms of building resilience and adapting to a future that is increasingly uncertain and also poses a whole series of risks and increasingly a recognition that we are faced with a systemic risk. Let's go to the next slide, please. So in brief, I mean, what is today about? Let's say we've been working with MinterEllison and our partners here to try and understand how do we work with non-exec directors to help them ask the right questions. Climate change is a scientific issue, but actually then has to be translated into business language and business thinking and be very much part of the DNA of an organization. And it's actually quite difficult to pick up an issue like this that can be so complex and have the right questions to ask of others to begin to explore whether or not your business, your interest area is actually resilient and has these issues managed correctly and is able to move forward in a world that's very uncertain, as I said earlier. So this is about empowering non-exec directors to ask the right questions, and the technique we've used here is something we've used several times before over the years of giving people the right question to ask and then having the right follow-up questions to further delve in and explore. So a bit like a very clever political journalist not letting a member of a government off the hook. It's the follow-up question and the follow-up after that that really drives down into, is this issue under control? Are we as a business on top of this? So our guidance is sector agnostic, which it has to be generalised, but of course it can be further developed into sector guidance and even into company guidance. We have looked at why physical climate risk matters to firms. So this is about physical risk, not transitional risk. We've produced the questions, but we've also given a summary of the state of the science as well as a way of refreshing and reading into key points. It's not meant to be an exhaustive view of everything to do with climate science, and that would be extremely difficult to do. Next slide, please. So the context of this is that climate change and the financial impacts of a changing climate are being increasingly understood as presenting a systemic risk. And we have now seen it placed onto the board level through things like TCFD and other regulatory and quasi-regulatory requirements, and it's going to remain there. This is not going to go away, and over time this will become an increasing feature of the way in which a board operates and thinks. And it's important to understand that when we're talking about a changing climate, we are really talking about material financial risks to the bottom line. This is not an environmental issue. This is a business and economic financial issue. Those organisations that treat this as somehow something that sits under somebody with a title of environment in their job description are actually misrepresenting and misunderstanding what this is about. This really goes to the core of a business because the risks translate, as it says here, into reputational, legal liability, competition market, credit, and ultimately the financial risks. And they're both tangible and intangible effects on your assets. A lot of the work so far has been on tangible physical assets, but actually, as we all know, the largest part of the valuation of the business is intangible assets, and physical risk can affect the intangible assets. So there clearly is imperative for corporates and financial institutions to understand, manage, and disclose physical climate related risks, and non-exec directors, we believe, have a major role to play in that process. Next slide, please. I won't go through all the slides, try to summarize on the slide here, but say there is more about this in the report, and the report also contains references to other sources of information. But what we really need to understand is the journey we're on. Climate change isn't something that starts tomorrow. Climate change, or a changing climate, has been with us now for the last 30, 40 years, probably more in some cases. And we've begun to recognise and appreciate that as our temperatures increase, the profound consequences they're having on both on social, environmental, and economic systems are things we cannot ignore. We cannot put them aside and think that's something to be sorted out in the future. The Paris Agreement set down two goals, a desire to hit 2 degrees C, or transition to 2 degrees C, and an aspiration to hit 1.5. But when we think about those limits, and really what they're doing is trying to stabilise the climate at an increase of 1.5 or 2 degrees. We cannot not be in a warmer temperature. Even if we switched off all the lights today and stopped our use of fossil fuels, climate change continues to grow. It's not something that goes away. But what we must understand is 1.5 and 2 degrees C aren't some sort of safe level. They're extremely dangerous levels of global warming. What they represent is now the least worst case we can effectively stabilise at. And even to transition to 1.5 and 2 degrees by 2050 to get to that net zero figure is looking increasingly challenging. As we leave each year and avoid making these radical changes, the steepness of the curve to transition just gets so steep. So we really are on some borrowed time here now. But as we move towards these 1.5 and 2 degrees C temperatures and above, the consequences on all our systems become ever greater. They are serious. They will involve and are involving financial losses, economic impacts, ecological damage, and people are dying. And the consequence of that is that it all presents itself as a systemic risk issue. And as we've seen from COVID-19, the world has been very unprepared in dealing with systemic risk issues. Next slide, please. So the role for non-executive directors and the issues to focus on is very much about how can you drive informed and proportionate corporate action on management of physical risks, ensuring the companies you work with, how can they adapt and thrive in the new climate reality, and spur companies on to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement. That's very much your role, as to hand on the shoulder and giving guidance and advice. And there are two key issues here. One is in understanding the impacts on the business from a changing climate, and secondly, the implications for business of evolving climate risk governance and disclosure regimes. We are heading into a very strict regulatory future. Next slide, please. So if you look at the first issue, the impacts of climate change on business, and again, I'm not going to go through all these in detail because time doesn't allow, and also these are very generic and they are very specific to each individual sector, and businesses within those sectors will operate and be affected differently. But what is clear, and we're seeing this now, we can see that physical assets are being damaged, their efficiency is being reduced, we're seeing supply chains being disrupted, and also the value chains as well. There are demands for products and services also changing, and potentially climate change drives market shift. As temperatures increase, what we buy, what consumers buy and demand will change. We can see worker health and productivity issues. We are very aware all the world's major intelligence agencies and military are very focused on geopolitical risks, things like climate migrants. And we are beginning to see significant breaches of all sorts of existing regulations and law, particularly environmental ones, which never actually took into account the potential impact of a changing climate. So all of these interactions all affect the way in which your business operates in the future. Next slide, please. And we also need to understand that certainly since TCFD, there's been a growing demand for regulation, particularly in Europe, but not entirely limited to that. We just set out 2 or 3 examples here. There are others. The UK releasing its Green Finance Strategy in 2019, and particularly in terms of the Financial Conduct Authority, publishing proposals requiring mandatory TCFD disclosures on a comply or explain basis for premium listed issuers. And of course, the issuers and the investors and the corporates, they all have to disclose about each other as well. So it's quite important to recognise that this is not something that you do as a silo approach. You have to engage with the other people or organisations in your network. I think one thing to note here is that when we look at things like the European Union and the taxonomy approach that it's doing in terms of sustainable finance, all these actions, particularly of large regional bodies, and including things like the NGFS working with the central banks of this world, as they start to develop their thinking, it actually has a snowball effect across the world. So US companies, for example, who are operating within UK, Italy, New Zealand, or whatever existing regulatory regime, cannot ignore the process and then how it relates back to their own shareholders and their own businesses operating in other regimes. Next slide, please. So what must companies do? I think, and the key role is, what should non-exec directors do, or what do we think they should do? And this is something, this whole process, we've been working very closely with MinterEllison particularly to try and understand how do we manage the situation and ensure that businesses don't fall into legal liability situations through either ignorance or not exploring something or misunderstanding issues as they develop. But it is really important that the approach non-exec directors take is to understand that the spectrum of risk, your business's risk landscape is changing in front of your eyes. And also, the market for your goods and services is changing in front of your eyes. There may be gradual changes. At some point, they may be significant shifts, but change is on the way. It's important that we apply scientific knowledge to this process. So in order to make prudent decisions, we do need to look at the science and understand what the best available information is. That information, that science won't tell you exactly what to do, where and when, but it will guide you. It really is beholden upon companies now to plan and implement targeted and proportionate financial and non-financial adaptation strategies. It's going to be extremely difficult for any company to stand up in a court of law and explain that climate change was not something it looked at because it didn't see it as an issue, when all its peers and other sectors are exploring these issues and beginning to report. Stress testing is extremely important. We've explained the scenarios you should use, and I'll come on to that in a minute. It's important you look at governance and risk management processes, align with the climate risk strategies and measures being taken at government level, particularly because they will drive some of the regulation. It's about investing in human and technical resources. You have to build capacity within your organisation, but it's also monitoring the progress you're making as well. Next slide, please. Just talk about scenarios. I mean, one thing to understand is the scenarios you need to look at in terms of physical risk are actually different to the scenarios you use for transition risk. This is a diagram that's taken out of a report for the banking sector for UNEP-FI, looking at the TCFD and how do we integrate that and implement that. And what it's trying to show is that as we move towards, or hopefully move towards, a 1.5 degrees C, 2 degrees C type stabilized climate, clearly the transition risks, the implications become ever greater. If we don't move towards those 1.52 degrees C and we stick at where we are at the moment, which is a 4 degrees C scenario track we're on, or a 3 degrees C if all countries undertook the actions they have stated, then the actual physical risks become ever greater. So when we're trying to look at business as usual and the potential worst case, we actually have a different set of scenarios to those that the transitions world will look at. Next slide, please. So just looking at these 9 questions, and again, we won't go into those in detail. The report is just literally just been released for you. What we tried to do is pull together 9 key questions, and those key questions have been aligned with the 4 pillars in the TCFD guidance of governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. So you'll see on the right-hand side the pillars, and then on the left-hand side the diamond. The grey diamonds relate to governance. The light red relates to resilience in terms of strategy. The dark red relates to metrics and targets, and the dark grey relates to the risk management processes. So each of the 9 questions sit under here. So as your organisation is moving its way through looking at governance, strategy and risk management metrics and targets, there are a set of questions to enable you to engage with the rest of your board and with the company. Let's move to the next slide, please. So as an example, and this is just an example, it's not particularly highlighted for any really particular reason, But on resourcing, we've identified here a question: does the board have access to the right skills and knowledge it needs to institute a robust physical climate risk management strategy and monitor performance? And this really is a question for you to be challenging your boards with. And then it enables you, through these series of follow-up questions, to start to drill down as to, well, where are those skills? Do we have them in place in the right point? Do we have the right advisors and experts supporting the company? And what's the company's plan about building in buy-in across all our workforce and staff, and also about building our capacity to actually manage in the future? Because in many ways, what climate change is about is opening minds up and to say the way in which we've practiced against what was seen to be as a stable climate is now not fit for purpose. We have to challenge our business model. Are we fit for purpose going forward? Next slide, please. So the 9 questions are set out. These are the heading questions. Each of these, to say, has a series of other questions. I think question 1, I think, has something like 7 or 8 follow-ups to go with it. So the key questions here are set out on governance. Next slide, please. On strategy, and then beginning to delve into risk management. And third slide, please. And here we're moving from risk management through to the metrics. So we tried to cover all bases. These questions can be refined, they can be developed to make them sector specific and even business specific, but they give you a starting point. And the next slide, please. So to sum up, the direct and indirect physical impacts of a changing climate are going to drive very different impacts on firms, their stakeholders and their customers, and it really is beholden upon a well-managed company to really have a good understanding of the world and how it's changing around them. It's also important that we recognise that these risks are financial. They're not environmental risks. They may manifest themselves as those, but the response to you as a business, or the impact on you as a business, is financial. These are bottom line issues. Disclosure requirements and investor expectations are changing and potentially very rapidly. And it's really important that we recognise that the oversight and ownership of risk sits ultimately at the boardroom level. And that is exactly where the NEDs need to be focused and understanding and ensuring that their companies and their boards are really addressing this. So the guidance has been is designed to inform and provide oversight. It's not there to answer every single issue and question, but it's a step forward on beginning that process of engagement for you as non-exec directors in your companies, but also for the companies to begin to talk to their shareholders as well. I think that's the next slide. Is that the...
Thank you very much, John.
That's it, yeah.
I will now be handing over to our colleague Ellie Mulholland over at MinterEllison, and she will be presenting on the governance, disclosure and liability angle.
Thanks, Richard, and thank you, John. Good afternoon, and thank you to the teams at Chapter 0 and Acclimatise for the opportunity to have this discussion today. I'm a corporate lawyer. Why do I need to understand the climate science? So the gradual onset changes, the acute events made more frequent and intense in a warmer world. Well, because it affects things that matter to me as a lawyer, particularly risk and liability. And for that tiny bit of time that we lawyers get to be positive, strategic opportunity. Now, when I say I need to understand it, I mean like in kind of like an upper high school kind of way, upper high school science. I'm not pouring into the discussion section of scientific papers and checking regressions and making my own judgments on scientific and statistical significance. But I need to understand the big concepts, the physical drivers, to know that these changes are non-linear and different across geographies and timescales. And I need to be inquisitive and ask the right questions of experts like Acclimatise and translate that into what it means for my role as a lawyer and the advice that I give to my clients. And then I think that non-executive directors are in a similar position to do your job well, to oversee appropriate risk management processes, to drive resilient strategies, to disclose meaningful information in compliance with mandatory obligations. You need to understand the physical risks of climate change too. So today I'm briefly going to talk about governance and liability, which are both drivers and consequences of climate-related physical risks being on the board agenda. And we're going to pick out a few bits of advice in the primer. Next slide, thanks, Richard. So John has introduced you to these 9 key questions, and you'll see, if you hit next, we'll see that good climate risk governance is at the top because it provides the foundation for the rest, assessing risk and impacts on the business, setting resilient strategy and targets, take out the opportunities. Next. And then we have liability. That's the pointy end of the stick, or the pointy end of the diamond in this case. And when I say that you don't want liability to be the wrong kind of driver, I mean the too late driver, because you or your company is sued for breach of directors' duties or misleading disclosure or failing to prevent a company's breach of environmental obligations when a physical risk materializes. You want liability to be the good kind of driver because you assess liability in advance and mitigate them. Next. Now we're seeing an ongoing ratchet in investor and regulatory expectations of governance and disclosure of physical risk by boards. For stakeholders, from investors to financial regulators like the PRA, the FCA, the 66 central banks and supervisors that are part of the NGFS, or Network for Greening the Financial Systems, they all understand that climate is not just carbon. This is not just a matter of disclosing greenhouse gas emissions and setting net zero targets. Good climate risk governance and disclosure also involves adaptation. So taking into account the physical risks of climate change, asking how resilient are your assets and value chains to the particular risks that your business faces today and to different warming scenarios in the future. And COVID has really shown the weakness of just-in-time efficiency maximisation business models. And to survive and thrive in a warming world, we will need to focus on anti-fragility, resilience, or what I've heard called just-in-case business models. Next. Now, a key governance driver is disclosure, and the UK leads the rise of the TCFD. And John mentioned the UK's move towards mandatory TCFD disclosures. Now, these TCFD disclosures of both physical and transition risks are recommended to be in annual reports. So, as non-executive directors, to sign off on those reports, you'll need to be sure of the robust processes underlying those disclosures. Next. And now I want to touch on an Australian development on the need to integrate climate risk into the financial statements and what that means for other jurisdictions that use IFRS like the UK. Now, I'm based here in London, but you might have heard my Australian accent. And Australia does not lead the world in climate policy, but actually, surprise, surprise, our accounting and audit standard setters are world leaders in integrating climate risk into their roles and mandates. So the guide on the left was first published in December 2018, updated in May 2019. And it represents an unequivocal statement by Australia's accounting and audit standard setters that climate-related risks, including physical risks, are relevant to accounting estimate materiality assessments, from fair asset values and impairments to changes in useful life assumptions and provisions for onerous contracts. Now, the ISB echoed the Australian guidance in their November 2019 article on the right. So many corporations already disclose their approach to physical climate-related risks, which is often in line with the recommendations of the TCFD. This primarily occurs in the narrative portions of the annual report or separate sustainability reports, which is ordinarily beyond the scope of financial audit engagement. But this guidance is particularly significant in repositioning climate-related physical risks squarely within the scope of external audit scrutiny, and therefore a matter for the audit committee and directors approving the financial statements. So if you think it's not mandatory guidance for you in the UK yet, this is the direction of travel. And Deloitte's guidance for Chapter 0 will actually be key to help with this. Next. So against the backdrop of these drivers, next. Now let's look at the governance and liability consequences with a taster of some of our Acclimatise and MinterEllison guidance. Starting with governance. So I've got some questions here, and a follow-up question is around is oversight, strategy, assurance and disclosure, those mechanisms in relation to physical climate risk, adequate to fulfil our directors' duties? Because ultimately this is a matter of directors' duties. Because physical risk is a financial risk, it's operational, credit, strategic, then you must exercise due care and diligence in governing that risk like you would any other, so as to promote the success of the company. Next. Now looking at some of the impacts on the business, and in particular the impacts on the financial statements. So thinking about the assumptions underlying the accounting estimates on costs and revenue, thinking how do our internal and external audit processes incorporate these considerations into the existing audit processes, and is our audit committee properly trained to oversee this? Next. Now thinking about liability, how might the company or board be exposed to litigation or liability connected with a failure to adequately oversee, manage or disclose these physical climate risks? And in the guidance we mentioned the Californian utility PG&E, which filed for bankruptcy in January last year because of liabilities relating to devastating and unprecedented wildfires. And its shareholders and creditors sued directors, officers and the banks involved in underwriting its debt. And the claims against the directors and officers were those on the risk and safety committees, so the ones that have particular responsibility for risk management oversight, including the physical risk management oversight. And ExxonMobil has been sued in Massachusetts for a failure to prepare its oil terminal for acute extreme weather events. And just last week, there was a claim against the Australian government for a failure to disclose both the physical and the transition risks to its sovereign bonds. Next. And another issue, the last one that I'll touch on today, is efficient risk pricing and allocation in your material contracts and strategic transactions. So thinking financing and M&A. Now, the increasingly foreseeable physical risks that Acclimatise talks about in the primer, thinking about the reasonable responses to these risks. It could mean that existing pro forma processes and contract terms may not efficiently identify or allocate the relevant physical risks within your contracts. So you need to ask your management questions like, have we integrated specialist climate risk modules into our due diligence procedures, including our legal due diligence? And does our approach to force majeure remain fit for purpose? And here I want to give a plug for an initiative I've involved with, which is the Chancery Lane project. We have commercial lawyers from private practice and in-house working together to use their legal expertise to rewire contracts to tackle climate change. And by way of example, in our climate contract playbook, we have a clause with really innovative climate risk allocation instead of just the usual force majeure. Thinking about COVID and climate, we need to draft differently so our contracts don't lead to adverse climate and social outcomes. We have some general counsels at some big UK headquartered multinationals involved. So you could ask your GC if they're using your contractual relationships to build resilience and to fulfill your climate goals. Next. Just to finish, at MinterEllison, we have a specialist climate risk governance team. We're unique in setting up our climate practice through a financial, economic and commercial law lens. And we have for years, so it's not backfilling an environmental or renewable energy practice. And we work with physical climate risk experts like Acclimatise to help our clients navigate a warming world. Next. And our contact details are here. So I'm going to leave it there for the moment, so there's some time for discussion, but back to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Ellie. That was excellent. So now, everybody, we have 10-15 minutes available for a question and answer. Please do use the chat function on the bottom right of the screen should you wish to ask any of the panelists questions. I'm just going to check what we have just now. So we don't have any questions so far. So maybe I'll kick off. So I'll put a question to you, Ellie. So we do have one question. To you, Ellie, in fact, could you expand a little bit more, please, on the new litigation just last week brought by, I think it was an Australian teenager, on the sovereign bonds?
Yeah, sure. So that was brought by a 23-year-old budding a law student, actually. So they're figuring out how to use the law for their own strategic and public interest goals. What it is it's a claim against the Australian government for a failure to disclose. So the Australian government and some Treasury and officials for a failure to disclose the risks associated with their sovereign bonds. So it's a class action against on behalf of the other retail investors in the bonds, and it's at its most basic, just a standard misleading representation claim for a failure to disclose the risks that arise in the transition, the physical risks to the bonds, alleging that because the tenor of some of the bonds is up to 2050, that Australia might not be able to pay them back. It also is a duty of care claim as well. So against against the Secretary of the Treasury and the issuing body, because the public officials, just like directors, owe duties of care. So they're very, very similar to that duty of care, skill and diligence. And so it alleges that by allowing the issuer, the Australian government, to breach their disclosure obligations, that they've actually breached their individual duties. It was just lodged last week. It's a class action. It's got a long way to go, but a lot of issuers are looking up because it's not specific to sovereign bond claims. So it really squarely puts climate-related risks within financial risks.
Wonderful. Thank you for that response. We do have another question for you as well. Is there anything that we can do to stimulate the UK accounting profession in particular to follow the Australian example? For example, by requiring in our contracts with accountants that they include a climate risk element.
The interesting thing around the Australian developments that were picked up by the ISB is that actually there's no new accounting rules, and it's just guidance on the existing mandatory guidance. And so that's actually, I think, where really key to understand is that this is the application of existing accounting standards requirements to climate change. And so that's where if we have the UK accounting standard setters, if they make the same connections, then they might publish their own guidance. But we're actually seeing the Big Four, particularly with Deloitte, they have published guidance on what climate risks means under existing accounting standards, which the accounting standards are legal requirements. So actually we've got the Big Four kind of working ahead of the national accounting bodies here, but we've got the IASB saying this is under existing IFRS standards. In terms of requiring our contracts with accountants include a climate risk element, the point is that it should be there already, particularly, for example, key audit matters. If it is a key audit matter, they should be doing that already. But it's around asking the right questions as non-executive directors and knowing that actually, perhaps if you don't ask the questions, they'll be asked of you, particularly if you're on the audit committee, because we do have, it can be picked up in terms of material misstatements. So it could be picked up by the auditors first.
Richard, can I just comment on that one? Because I think there's another wider issue here that for all professionals, and in that we've often heard, for example, in the construction sector, architects and engineers saying, I've not included an assessment of physical risk because the client didn't ask for it. Now, the issue actually really is for all professionals to realise and accept that they're under a duty of care to their client to give them the best available advice. And this applies whether you're a separate contracted consultancy company or you're a professional working within a business. It is actually your professional duty to give best available advice. And I fear that would be extremely difficult to do if you did not give your client or your employer advice that took into account the impacts of a changing climate. I think people have to accept they do have a professional responsibility here as well.
Thank you both. Another question, maybe we'll start with you, John, on this as well.
Okay.
What is the one key question I should put to the board? And I'd like, Ellie, your thoughts on that following John. And related, how frequently are you seeing climate risks on corporate risk registers?
I mean, any one of those 9 questions could be put to a board. But I would start, as Ellie has said, start with governance, because the primary objective of the board is to govern responsibly, correctly, and in line with both your obligations to your stakeholders and in line with the statutory requirements of the jurisdiction in which you're operating in. So I would start with the governance questions. What's the second part to that question? Sorry, because I can't see that one in front of me.
The second part is, how frequently are you seeing climate risks on corporate registers? And related to that as well, there's another question. Can you give examples of the changes companies have made to their strategy as a result of their climate risk assessments?
Okay. Well, in terms of seeing corporate registers, I mean, first of all, they're not necessarily disclosed, and it's a question of seeing what actually has been published in financial reporting and soft or hard reporting. But we are beginning to see this coming through. I personally suspect there's an awful lot of companies out there who are doing a great deal of risk assessment work, but of course companies tend not to report until they know how to manage the risk, and then they report the management of the risk. So there is a bit of a time lag here still. Can I give some examples of the changes that companies have made? Well, you know, my background is in the UK water industry, and back in the early and then the mid 1990s, the water industry began to take climate change extremely seriously, and the whole strategy of investment for the water industry took on board the impacts of a changing climate. So here you have a whole industry that is completely encapsulated and integrated risk assessment, the whole process of scenarios. We were doing this in 1994 in my previous company. So yes, there are many companies out there who are doing this. Sometimes they don't call it climate change adaptation resilience, they just call it operational efficiency or better asset management. But the reality is a large number of companies now are acting on this and actually doing something about it.
Ellie, maybe you would like to come in on the either of those questions, but in particular, whether there's a key question that you would put to the board.
Oh, key question. I feel like we're getting into an echo chamber. I would agree with John. It really starts with governance, and actually, I suppose I'll now mangle up a bunch of the 9 key questions, because it really is, are we integrating physical climate risks into those existing governance processes that we have? So that's when we're thinking around our narrative disclosures of material issues in our annual reports, our financial statements, our risk management oversight, our strategy. Are we governing, integrating physical climate risks into all of our governance activities, understanding that physical climate risks are just like any other financial risk, but they're special because of the non-linear decisions we make today, breadth and depth. There's a reason they're special, so we need to think about them differently, but we also need to think about them the same. So therefore, we don't need to entirely reinvent the wheel, but we do need to integrate it into everything that we do in a really nuanced way. And so I would start with how we're integrating this into governance. And the physical risk register, I mean, I agree with John that we don't frequently see them, but just an issue that I'd flag, particularly from a lawyer's perspective in private M&A transactions, we're starting to see asks for climate-related risks on the risk register when in the due diligence processes. Sometimes they're there, but not called climate-related risks, in which case then you're thinking, well, do you really understand the particular needs to govern for these really particular risks? Or sometimes they're not there at all and it's a complete blind spot, and then that will need to be taken into account for pricing and liability and resilience. So private M&A transactions, just this is a really specific lawyerly thing, but we're starting to see it in due diligence there. But otherwise, we, like John said, we're not seeing it until it kind of comes out in the disclosures.
Thank you very much. And just time for one final question. There's a question for you, Ellie, about the PG&E example. So the question is whether you could expand on what the charge was against PG&E.
Okay. So there's two things. There were charges and then there were claims. So there were charges, essentially involuntary manslaughter charges against the company there were a horrific amount of people died and property was destroyed and a lot of suffering. So the company pled guilty to those involuntary manslaughter charges that were like any other criminal charge brought by the state. The claims that I'd referred to were civil claims. So it was litigation for monetary compensation. So claims brought by shareholders, creditors, and against the company, the directors and officers, and the underwriting banks. So they're the more commercial law claims, things like misleading disclosures, the strict liability that you have on underwriting banks for what's in the prospectus. So those kinds of the suite of commercial law claims that we can see can be enlivened by physical risk when physical risks materialise. Perhaps the interesting thing about the criminal claim is that in pleading guilty to that involuntary manslaughter, it meant that the company had to make admissions around what it knew, because there's a certain kind of, and what a company knows. It means that there's a certain kind of knowledge element to that. So it'll be interesting to see whether that kind of flows through. But there have been, on the whole, the big suite of claims has been settled for them to get out of bankruptcy last month. So I think they paid out about $25 billion in claims. So everyone went at them for everything.
And just to add to that, one of the interesting things about the PG&E case is that the risk was well known. So, for example, one of PG&E's competitors in California, San Diego Power, I think they're called, had noted several years earlier that they'd had to pay out claims because of wildfire risk and the issue of transmission lines coming down and causing fire, actually creating the fire situation. And they decided several years before that it was actually cheaper to cut the power during high wildfire, high strong wind conditions and pay out claims for outages rather than risk the fire itself being caused by a line coming down. And that was well documented. And so it demonstrates the point that it's not just about asking your own company what it's doing. It's also about, does your company know what its competitors are doing, and can you learn from them? Because clearly, there is going to be a peer pressure and a peer comparison, particularly in the context of investor interest.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so we're almost out of time now, so it just leaves me to thank the panel, Karina Litvak, John Firth, Ellie Mulholland, and thank everybody for joining us today for the launch of this report. As Karina opened with, this is the first guidance that Chapter 0 has issued for non-executive directors focused on physical risk. So we're really pleased to be part of it. It is designed as a practical document, so we'll hope you'll take it away, digest it, and use it today, tomorrow. NEDs have agency. I think that's the key message from this report, to really help, assist, handhold, guide corporates in their decision-making around these issues. It's really important that NEDs, where possible, do exercise this influence. It's to the benefit of their companies and to wider society, ultimately. So I think, yeah, thank you for joining. I hope it's useful. We appreciate your feedback. And of course, we also appreciate your participation in the survey, which I've shared in the chat function. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.